the National Development Plan 2021 to 2025, Nigeria's government says public debts will hit 50.22 trillion naira by 2023, with domestic debt at 28.75 trillion naira and external debt at 21.47 trillion naira. This comes as the government plans to borrow 12 trillion naira from local and multilateral lenders. The Debt Management Office disclosed that the public debt was 38 trillion naira as of the end of the third quarter of 2021, with the total debt stock rising by 2.54 trillion naira in 3 months from July to September 2021. The government also disclosed that it needs money to finance the plan of 348.1 trillion naira. The borrowing framework in the plan is 45% each for both foreign and domestic borrowing. While no nation can achieve long-lasting development without some form of borrowing to finance growth-enabling projects and programs, Nigeria's rate of borrowing has raised concerns. Analysts say the debt needs to be sustainable through the diversification of the productive base of the economy. According to the 2022 appropriation bill, the government is looking at increasing its debt portfolio by 6 trillion naira next year to finance the 2022 budget, of which it hopes to spend 3.9 trillion naira in servicing its outstanding obligations, both locally and internationally, from the 16 trillion naira budget. There are concerns that Africa's largest economy may soon run out of room to finance its debts. Nigeria's plan to borrow 12 trillion naira is our focus today. I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun. Welcome. This is Business Edge. Now joining me is Taiwo Oyedele, Fiscal Policy Partner and Africa Tax Leader at PwC. Taiwo, it's good to have you back on Business Edge. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Tolu. It's a pleasure to be here.
So Nigeria's debt conversation is a conversation about numbers and figures. So I want us to start from there. The public debt has been on the increase for the past several years, and many says there has been an increase from the beginning of the Buhari administration till now. What's the rate of increase you've seen for the nation's debt, both domestic and international, in the intervening years?
Yeah, thank you, Tolu. So I think the reality is that we have been borrowing. Like many people have said, including myself, borrowing in and of itself is not a problem, but the pace at which we are borrowing, especially within the context of our revenue generation and also the application of those borrowings do call for a lot of concern. So, which is why it's understandable and the Nigerians keep talking about this. Over the past 5-6 years, we have seen our debt, as a country, public debt, rising from around 12 trillion to now about 38 trillion naira. And in fact, many of us would argue, including institutions like the IMF, to say that even the 38 trillion that we're reporting does not paint the full picture of the public debt that we have in Nigeria. Notable, amongst the numbers that we think should be included is the ways and means financing by the central bank, which is currently at over 10 trillion naira. So that's really public debt as well that is not being captured. They also have, significant amounts of money, indebtedness in form of domestic arrears, where you have awarded contracts, contractors have, executed to some extent, but they haven't been paid. You also have contingencies and other obligations by, sometimes government agencies, and you also have these across both federal and sub-national. So the growth in our debt, if we're going to be very complete, has been very significant, or maybe exponential, to put it, the way it is, and that is a source of concern. What is even rising even faster is the cost of servicing the debt to revenue as a ratio of revenue is alarming. Easily over 70% at the federal government level. So you would know that while the debt to GDP ratio is still somewhere around under 30%, if the cost of servicing it is already, taking all our revenue away, then you would know that we're not far from a level where we get to, what is called a debt trap. So really, it's not sustainable.
So this is not a new conversation. We've spoken throughout 2021 on Nigeria's financial, fiscal, economic health as it may be, and there's no time that the conversation has not touched on the debt. There are concerns that the country is taking on too much debt, as you said, is taking it on too quickly as well, and that there are no sustainable ways for Nigeria to pay back these debts. What concerns do you have about the debt that Nigeria has taken on and apparently is continuing to take on with this request now for 12 trillion naira in loans to be approved by the National Assembly?
Yeah, I have many concerns. Maybe I'll just name a few of them and try and, explain them. The first one is, I think, the budget discipline, or if you like, put it differently as expenditure efficiency. So when you have a country that is poor, let's put it that way, because Nigeria is indeed a poor country by every standard. In fact, the size of public expenditure as a percentage of GDP, it's only ahead of about, I think, 4 countries in the world, and that's, Haiti, DRC, Sudan, and Venezuela. So which means even if we have efficiency in the way we spend our money, the size of the money itself is too small. On top of that, we lack efficiency at the highest level. You will find in the 2022 budget that is going to be signed by the president in a couple of days, you find some expenses that you keep asking yourself, should this be a priority at this time? For example, the National Assembly has, some billions of naira for building a library, and then they also have about 300 million naira for what they call e-library. So I'm asking myself, really, what do you want in an e-library? So put soft copies of your reference materials online. People will do that for a couple of millions of naira. Should you be building a physical library at this time with those billions of naira? So you have those issues, and it cuts across executive expenses, MDAs, a lot of duplicated expenses. So expenditure efficiency and budget discipline is one big area of concern for me. The next one for me would be revenue optimization. We know that our revenue is very low, and you hear governments say every time that we do not have a debt problem, but we do have a revenue problem. I think we're saying the same thing. But then the way we behave does not speak to the fact that we want to address this as an issue that is of national importance and is urgent. You still have various MDAs, some of them operating like a government on their own, generating revenue and spending it. You still have government creating all manner of revenue agency and all this and that every now and then. You do not have this synergy and harmonization. So today you have the FRS as the main revenue generating agency at the federal government level. But then you still have, customs generating revenue in many countries that's under the same agency. You have the, NIMASA, you have even the commission created under the Petroleum Industry Act. It's also collecting revenue. And the list goes on and on. And the more of this you do, even NIPOS is trying to collect revenue. The more of this you do, the more the leakages you create in the system, and therefore your inability to mobilize revenue. And I think the third one that gives me a lot of concern is the, subsidy mismanagement. Because the reality is, even if you have a lot of money, we are not at a point where we can afford to spend over 1 trillion naira a year just to subsidize petrol, the bulk of which is going to neighboring countries and therefore enriching, corrupt people rather than the average and poor Nigerians. So these are some of the major concerns around our debt management and the fact that we do not seem to have an integrated strategy that connects revenue to expenditure and debt management.
All right, so before we go for a break, let me ask about the projects. So the concern has also been that some of the projects that Nigeria is borrowing for are not self-sustaining, self-financing, will not help the country to pay back the loans being taken. And in October, the presidency listed some 15 projects that were financed with more than $4 billion from multilateral institutions under the 2018 to 2021 medium-term external borrowing plan. So they include the Nigeria Sustainability Water Supply, Sanitation and Hygiene Project, the Agro-Climatic Resilience in Arid Zone Landscape Project, the Livestock Productivity and Resilience Project, construction of a branch of the Apapa Tin Can Island Port under the Lagos-Ibadan Railway. You also have the National Digital Identity Management Project, education projects, and more. When it comes to financing, getting loans and borrowing money for these projects, is this what Nigeria should be borrowing for? Are we on the right path? We understand that there are gaps, infrastructure gaps, there are gaps in education that must be filled somehow, but is this the way to do it, by taking on debt that these projects will not really help pay for even in the next 15 to 20 years?
I'll say yes and no. So many of those projects, you will, agree with government that these are areas where we should be spending money, even if we have to borrow. Things to do with how do you use technology to even just do identity management. How do you ensure that there's education and healthcare, stuff to do with human capital development. In terms of hard infrastructure, many of those projects also, I would admit that they're the right thing to do. The only issue being that even for the project that we should be doing, you have to worry about contract inflation. Are we spending 10 billion when we could easily have spent, maybe 5 billion for even better quality? The other aspect to it is that some of those capital expenditure, government should not be poking and willing and seeking to do them by themselves because they just don't have the resources. So you need to create the right policy environment for the private sector to invest in those infrastructure to the extent that they are commercially viable. I think it was the Minister for Transportation who said that the rail is generating about 300 million naira per month. What they haven't said to us is what's the cost, including the cost of financing the borrowing. And are we making profits or are we making losses? In which case, we're creating more problems for tomorrow. So this transparency is very important. Make sure that the capital expenditure and investment that can be better done by the private sector is done by the private sector. And whatever is left of it that is required by the federal government or the state government should be done in an efficient manner without budget padding or inflation.
Mm-hmm. All right, Taiwo, hold on. When we come back, we'll look at that number that has many people in, I don't know, maybe we'd say in a tizzy. So the Debt Management Office has disclosed that Nigeria's public debt was 38 trillion naira as at the end of the third quarter of 2021, with the total debt stock rising to 2.54 trillion in 3 months from July to September 2021. But the number that has caught attention now is 50 trillion naira. That is expected to be the estimated value of Nigeria's debt by 2023. We'll pick up this part of the conversation after the break. And still with me is Taiwo Oyedele, Fiscal Policy Partner and Africa Tax Leader at PwC. Now, the Nigerian government is pushing its debt stock to about 50.22 trillion naira by 2023, with domestic debt to stand at 28.75 trillion and external debt at 21.47 trillion. Some economists say that getting to the threshold of 50 trillion naira plus would put Nigeria in a financially precarious situation, and paying back would be near impossible. This may also limit the growth of the economy in the long run. So let me bring Taiwo back into this conversation. 50 trillion naira in debt in just about 2 years coming. That's what's being estimated. What do you think the impact of this would be on Nigeria?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, the 50 trillion, I think because of the symbolic number it represents, is the reason why we're having this conversation. Or maybe one of the reasons. Unfortunately, I do not even think that we're going to end up at 50 trillion by 2023. We are going to exceed 50 trillion for a number of reasons. One is that you need to, capture all the debt, public debt. And if you do that, you would easily be reaching 50 trillion by even 2022. The two other factors is that even in the 2022 budget, we have actually now behaved as if, it doesn't matter that we need to borrow more. The National Assembly decided that we're going to raise the budget from about 16.4 trillion to 17.1 trillion. That's an additional 700 billion. And what did they do? they adjusted the benchmark price from 57, I think, to about 62, right? And they thought that that means we make more revenue. That means nothing actually for revenue. The revenue we're going to make next year will be the same thing, whether you estimate the benchmark at $1 or $100. But they've used that now as an excuse to jack up the expenses, including their own budget. Now, that in itself is a problem. The other one is that if you think about it, there are some very significant expenditure that haven't been captured, even in this budget that is significantly deficit financed. You see the police, salaries increased by 20%. It's not in the budget. You have the, National Population Commission. There's a plan to do population census in 2022. You have even the subsidy removal and the palliative that government is promising. It's not in the budget. I also have even INEC, coming with hundreds of billions, I think over 300 billion in budget, which may even increase further. So when you factor all of this in, one thing is certain: we're going to have a supplementary budget to spend even more. And if you look at what we have performed, how we have performed over the past 3, 4, 5 years, we have consistently underperformed on revenue, and we have performed well in meeting expenditure, especially recurrent and debt service, and therefore we have consistently spent more in terms of budget deficit than we planned for. If you put all of this together, the only answer that you get is that by 2023, our debt would actually exceed 50 trillion naira. Would this be sustainable? I think one way to answer that question is if we're able to increase revenue mobilization significantly, such that the cost of servicing the debt is maybe some 15-20%, I would say then we are getting to the path of sustainability. America today has, debt that is more than its GDP. But the cost of servicing it is in single digits in terms of percentage of revenue. So nobody cares or worries about that. So it's Japan and the likes of other major countries. So this is where the issue is, and then we have to improve on our efficiency in terms of how do you utilize revenue, not just borrowing and telling us it's infrastructure, even when the infrastructure is not self-financing.
Okay. So when we have this conversation, I believe the last time you did mention the states, and a lot of the focus when it comes to the debt conversation ends up being solely on the federal government. But Nigerian states, its federating units, are also taking on large amounts of debt that they themselves seem possibly incapable of also paying down. Why do we need to put closer scrutiny on the states, even as we're worrying about what's happening at the federal level for loans?
No, it's very important. Actually, I think that's even a more important level of government in terms of governance, being closer to the people and feeling the impact on a day-to-day basis. But unfortunately, Nigerians have always been fixated on the federal government. I think it was last week or thereabout, or 2 weeks ago, that Lagos State went to the capital market to borrow by 100 billion naira. I'll say Lagos State is still in a position where it will seem sustainable, provided they use the fund in a way that is self-financing and productive to the overall economy. But at the end of the day, this 50 trillion we're talking about by 2023, it's not the debt of the federal government alone, it's the debt of the federation, like the whole country. And at the sub-national level, we do not pay sufficient attention to their budgeting process, their expenditure, transparency, and utilization of those revenue. And you will see some state like, Cross River State would easily budget over 1 trillion naira and call it some very interesting names. Whereas in the history of that state, they've never generated 100 billion in IGR plus amount they share from the federation account. So how realistic is that? If you put all the budget of the states together, you see that the picture is even more dire at that level than it is at the federal level. For us to address the issue of development, the issue of debt sustainability and revenue mobilization, we have to always look at both the federal and the state and, in fact, the local government level altogether.
All right, so Taiwo, before we wrap up, let me ask you this. So the National Development Plan has a borrowing framework, 45% each for both foreign and domestic borrowing, while other financing services account for 10%. But what I find interesting is even in that plan, the government is targeting a reduction in total public debt by 2025. That would be 2 years after we hit the 50 trillion naira mark. And you're saying that we're definitely going to surpass that by our estimation. Debt servicing obligations have continued to gulp a large percentage, upwards sometimes of about 97% of Nigeria's total revenue, and that was in 2020. And this is a trend that's continued. How can Nigeria be in a position to reduce its total debt stock in 2025? And even if we remove the target of 2025, how does Nigeria begin that process?
Yeah, I think it has to be a process that starts with, accepting the reality and being truthful and honest and being sincere with ourselves. First, we have to measure exactly what is the size of our public debt. And secondly, we should not fiddle with, what we borrow money for and play politics with it. The Fiscal Responsibility Act, for example, limits the basis for borrowing at all levels of government to only capital expenditure and human development. And capital expenditure there is defined to be any asset that lasts more than 1 year. I think that in itself is faulty. We need to revisit that. And then what is human development? And now the Finance Act of 2022, that's the Finance Bill 2021 that I think has been passed now, is suggesting that we even add another one to it that they call expenditure for critical national importance. What does that really mean? We have to walk back from those kind of issues and have clarity as to why we borrow, what we borrow for, what can it be, what is it that the private sector can do better, what can government do better. Some of the ways we can raise money easily as a country is to privatize all assets and resources that are better managed by the public sector, by the private sector, including the NNPC. Privatizing NNPC today, put it in the hands of competent people in the private sector, can easily release tens of billions of dollars to Nigeria on an annual basis. So we need to look for these ways and then put more transparency into how we borrow, the terms with which we borrow, and then how do we spend the money and the accountability for them. It has to be done in a transparent manner to the people of Nigeria, because Nigerians are indeed the number one stakeholder in this organization called Nigeria.
All right, Taiwo, we'll end the conversation there, but I know we'll definitely be talking about this in the new year as well. And you've touched on something interesting, the case for privatizing national assets for Nigeria, and that's something we'll look forward to talking to you about. But Taiwo Oyedele, thank you so much for joining me as always.
Thank you, Tolu, for having me.
Thank you. And debt servicing obligations in Nigeria have been a massive drain on government's resources. Of the 3.42 trillion naira generated in revenue, Nigeria spent 3.34 trillion in debt servicing. Also, 3.3 trillion naira was set aside for debt servicing in the assented 2021 budget, about a quarter, that's 24.3% of the entire 13.6 trillion naira total expenditure. This is a worrying trend and one that many say will put Nigeria in tough times in the years ahead. You're watching Business Edge. When we come back, NC4 to watch. Now we start in South Africa with the court ruling. A high court now has blocked Shell from conducting seismic testing offshore South Africa's pristine Wild Coast. Now this is the latest ruling in a case seeking to prevent the oil major from exploring for oil and gas. On December 3rd, a different high court order gave Shell the go-ahead to conduct an extensive seismic survey of South Africa's eastern coast, but this is stopped by the recent ruling that forms part of a broader court application contending that Shell did not have the necessary environmental approvals. Shell says it respects the court's decision. And this is a story covered a few weeks ago, so you can find it, of course, on our YouTube channel. And staying in South Africa, the South African Local Government Association has submitted an application to the Pretoria High Court for a declaratory order that will give South African municipalities exclusive rights to administer, distribute, and sell electricity throughout South Africa. Kenya will slap a 5 million Kenyan shilling or 5-year imprisonment for individuals who unlawfully and intentionally disclose and disseminate Huduma Mamba information. Now, those who give false information or make false declarations for the registration also face a 3 million Kenyan shilling fine or 3 years in prison. The Huduma Manba Bill 2021 seeks to curb unlawful use of information like names, dates of birth, postcodes, and residence. Nigerians have continued to abandon check transactions as POS transactions rise to 13.67 trillion naira in 3 years. Data from the Nigeria Interbank Settlement System portal showed that the aggregate POS transactions between January 2019 and November 2021 were 13.67 trillion naira, while total check transactions within the same period stood at 10.67 trillion naira. And that's the conversation for you today on Business Edge. Don't forget to download our mobile app and, of course, subscribe to our YouTube channel for any of the conversations on the big business, economic, and financial stories from here on the continent. Follow us on social media. We are at News Central TV. I'll see you again, 11 a.m. West African time. I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun.